When it comes to rock legends, few bands have spawned as many bizarre stories, occult connections, and jaw-dropping incidents as Led Zeppelin. From playing their guitars with violin bows to allegedly performing secret rituals for fame, the band's off-stage antics were often more outrageous than their thunderous performances. Behind the mystical symbols and stadium-shaking riffs lies a treasure trove of eccentric behavior, strange recording techniques, and controversies that would make even the wildest rock stars blush. Here are the 15 weird facts you didn't know about Led Zeppelin. Fact 1. Jimmy Page's haunted occult mansion. In 1971, Jimmy Page purchased one of Scotland's most notorious properties, Boleskine House, a remote manor on the shores of Loch Ness that had once belonged to Aleister Crowley, the infamous British occultist, known as the wickedest man in the world. Page, who had developed a deep fascination with Crowley's writings and magical practices, saw the house as the perfect retreat where he could study the occult and escape the pressures of Led Zeppelin's growing fame. But Boleskine House came with a dark history that extended far beyond Crowley's ownership, and Page quickly discovered that the property's sinister reputation was well-earned. According to Page himself, the house had been the site of terrible violence long before Crowley ever set foot there, including a church that had burned to the ground with the entire congregation trapped inside, and at least one beheading that left its ghostly mark on the property. Page told Rolling Stone magazine that he could sometimes hear the sound of a severed head rolling down the halls, a chilling reminder of the house's violent past. The supernatural activity at Boleskine House wasn't limited to mysterious sounds, as Page discovered when he tried to hire staff to maintain the property. Housemaids would arrive eager to work but would quit almost immediately after experiencing the house's oppressive atmosphere, refusing to spend another night under its roof. Even more disturbing, workmen brought in to make repairs would sometimes suffer complete mental breakdowns, with at least one going completely mad while working on the property. Page later explained that while Crowley had certainly conducted magical rituals at Boleskine House, including attempts to summon supernatural entities, the evil presence that seemed to permeate the building had been there long before the occultists' arrival. The spirits that Crowley had allegedly summoned during his time there had simply added to the existing darkness, creating what Page described as an almost unbearable concentration of negative energy that made the house nearly impossible to live in for any extended period. Fact 2. The notorious Mudshark Incident. One of rock and roll's most infamous and disturbing legends emerged from Led Zeppelin's stay at Seattle's Edgewater Inn following their performance at the Seattle Pop Festival on July 27, 1969. The Edgewater Inn was uniquely positioned directly over Puget Sound, allowing guests to fish directly from their hotel room windows, which the band members did during their stay, successfully catching a mud shark from the waters below. According to the most widely circulated version of this story, which first appeared in Stephen Davis's 1985 biography, Hammer of the Gods, the band later used pieces of this fish in a graphic sexual encounter with a red-haired groupie who had been tied to a bed in one of their rooms. The book's account, which relied heavily on information from Led Zeppelin's road manager Richard Cole, described the incident in explicit detail that shocked readers and became part of rock mythology. However, the truth behind this legendary tale remains murky, with multiple conflicting versions emerging over the years that cast doubt on who was actually responsible and what really happened. In some versions of the story, it was road manager Richard Cole himself who was the primary participant, while the band members were either absent or only peripherally involved. The band Vanilla Fudge has also claimed responsibility for the incident, with their drummer Carmine Appice stating that the groupie in question had actually been with him and that their keyboardist Mark Stein had filmed the entire encounter. Adding to the confusion, various tellings of the story have changed details like the type of fish involved, with some versions claiming it was a red snapper or swordfish rather than a mud shark. John Bonham was reportedly the only Led Zeppelin member actually present during whatever incident occurred, though exactly what role he played remains unclear. The story has never been definitively confirmed or denied by the surviving band members, leaving it as one of rock's most notorious unsolved mysteries that continues to fuel debates about the excesses of the 1970s rock scene. Fact 3. Jimmy Page's whipped cream hotel surprise. During one of Led Zeppelin's early tours, Jimmy Page and John Bonham found themselves stuck in a hotel room with what they considered to be an excess of eager female fans waiting nearby, and apparently decided that the situation called for something completely unexpected. According to rock folklore, the two musicians were feeling particularly bored and looking for a way to make their encounter with the group of waiting admirers more memorable than the typical rock star meet and greet. Page, who was known for his theatrical tendencies both on and off stage, came up with what can only be described as one of the most bizarre entrance strategies in rock history. He decided to strip completely naked and then cover his entire body from head to toe in whipped cream, transforming himself into what must have been a truly surreal sight. Rather than simply walking into the room where the fans were waiting, Page took his unusual presentation one step further by arranging for hotel staff to actually wheel him into the room, presumably on some kind of cart or room service trolley. The reaction of the female fans who were expecting to meet the legendary Led Zeppelin guitarist can only be imagined, as they were suddenly confronted with the sight of Page covered entirely in whipped cream being delivered to them like some kind of bizarre dessert. This incident perfectly captures the kind of spontaneous and outrageous behavior that made Led Zeppelin's offstage antics almost as legendary as their musical performances, showing how the band members were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to surprise and shock both their fans and themselves. While details about what happened after Page's whipped cream entrance remain unclear, the story has become part of Led Zeppelin mythology as an example of the creative and completely unpredictable ways the band members would approach even the most routine aspects of touring life. The incident also demonstrates the close friendship and shared sense of humor between Page and Bonham, who were apparently both willing participants in this particularly memorable hotel room stunt. Fact 4. John Bonham's fatal 40-shot breakfast. On September 24, 1980, John Bonham began what would tragically become his final day with a breakfast that revealed the devastating extent of his alcohol dependency. When he was picked up to attend rehearsals for Led Zeppelin's upcoming North American tour, Bonham decided to start drinking immediately, consuming 4 quadruple vodka screwdrivers before the day had barely begun. Each of these drinks contained 4 shots of vodka, meaning that Bonham had already consumed the equivalent of 16 shots of alcohol before most people would have finished their morning coffee, and he had taken only a single bite of the sandwich that accompanied this extraordinary liquid breakfast. As the day progressed, and the band gathered for what should have been routine rehearsals, Bonham continued his relentless drinking, showing no signs of slowing down despite having already consumed what would be considered a dangerous amount of alcohol for most people. The drummer, who had been struggling with increasing alcohol problems for years, seemed determined to drink himself into oblivion, and by the end of the day, medical experts later determined that he had consumed approximately 40 shots of vodka, which equals an entire liter of the spirit. This staggering amount of alcohol created a blood alcohol level that was simply incompatible with life, and Bonham was found dead the following morning by bassist John Paul Jones, having choked on his own vomit during the night. The coroner's report confirmed that Bonham had consumed the equivalent of 40 shots of vodka in his system, a quantity so massive that it demonstrated just how severe his drinking problem had become in the final years of Led Zeppelin. The tragic irony of Bonham's death was that it occurred just as Led Zeppelin was preparing to embark on what was planned to be their biggest tour ever, with tickets selling at a rate of 72,000 per day. Instead of celebrating their continued success, the remaining band members made the decision to disband Led Zeppelin permanently recognizing that no one could possibly replace the thunderous drumming style that had been such an essential part of their sound. Fact 5. The band nearly died in a mountain pass. During the winter of 1969 or 1970, Led Zeppelin came dangerously close to having their career end before it had truly begun, when they found themselves trapped in life-threatening conditions while driving from Seattle to Spokane through a treacherous mountain pass during a severe snowstorm. The band was still in the very early stages of their career, having only formed in 1968 and released their debut album just months earlier, which makes this near disaster all the more significant in rock history. The journey that nearly killed the future legends of rock began as what should have been a routine drive between two Pacific Northwest cities. But winter weather in the mountainous region between Seattle and Spokane can be extremely dangerous even under the best circumstances. The mountain passes that connect these cities are notorious for sudden weather changes, steep grades, and narrow roads that become nearly impassable when snow and ice create hazardous driving conditions, and Led Zeppelin found themselves caught in exactly these kinds of treacherous circumstances. As the band's vehicle struggled through the heavy snow and increasingly dangerous road conditions, they faced the very real possibility of becoming stranded in freezing temperatures with limited visibility and no immediate way to call for help. Since this was decades before cell phones became available, the situation grew so dire that the band members genuinely feared for their lives. Realizing that they could easily become victims of the harsh winter conditions that regularly claimed the lives of travelers who became trapped in these remote mountain areas. The fact that Led Zeppelin managed to survive this harrowing experience and make it safely to their destination means that rock history avoided losing one of its most influential bands before they had the chance to record classics like Stairway to Heaven, Whole Lotta Love, and Kashmir. Had the weather conditions been just slightly worse, or had their vehicle broken down in the middle of the mountain pass, the world might never have experienced the musical legacy that Led Zeppelin would go on to create over the following decade of their career. Fact 6. Jimmy Page's violin bow guitar technique. One of Jimmy Page's most distinctive and mysterious performance techniques actually originated during his days as a session musician in London during the mid-1960s, when a classical string player working on the same recording session suggested that Page try using a violin bow on his guitar strings. The session musician, who normally wouldn't interact much with rock musicians since there was often tension between classical and rock players in the studio, took the unusual step of not only suggesting the technique, but also showing Page the proper way to hold and use a violin bow. Page later recalled that the initial sounds he produced were far from perfect, describing them as squeaks that most guitarists would have dismissed as mistakes or unwanted noise. However, these unusual sounds intrigued Page rather than frustrating him, and he began to see the potential for creating entirely new textures and atmospheres that couldn't be achieved through traditional guitar playing techniques. He didn't immediately develop the technique into something usable, but the seed had been planted for what would become one of his most recognizable musical signatures. By the time Page joined the Yardbirds in 1966, he had begun experimenting more seriously with the violin bow technique, using it to add psychedelic and otherworldly elements to the band's blues-based repertoire. The bow allowed him to create sustained, droning notes that seemed to hang in the air much longer than normal guitar sounds, and when combined with effects like distortion, echo, and wah-wah pedals, the results were truly haunting and unlike anything else being produced in rock music at the time. When Led Zeppelin formed in 1968, Page made the violin bow technique a central part of their sound, most famously using it on Dazed and Confused. From their debut album and during extended live performances where he would often stretch the bowed guitar sections to create hypnotic, almost ritualistic musical experiences. The technique became so associated with Page that seeing him on stage with a violin bow became as iconic as his Gibson Les Paul guitar, creating some of the most memorable visual and sonic moments in rock history. Fact 7. Robert Plant recorded in a wheelchair. In 1976, Robert Plant found himself facing one of the most challenging periods of his career when he was forced to record Led Zeppelin's seventh studio album, Presence, while confined to a wheelchair and suffering from excruciating physical pain following a serious car accident in Greece. The crash had left Plant with severe injuries to his leg and ankle that required extensive medical treatment and made it nearly impossible for him to stand for extended periods, let alone perform with his usual energetic stage presence. Despite his physical limitations and the constant pain he was experiencing, Plant was determined not to let his injuries delay the band's recording schedule, and he made the difficult decision to proceed with the album sessions even though he could barely move around the studio. The recording took place at Musicland Studios in Munich, Germany, where Plant would be wheeled into the vocal booth in his wheelchair and positioned in front of the microphone to deliver his vocal performances while dealing with both the physical discomfort of his injuries and the emotional stress of wondering whether he would ever fully recover. The remarkable thing about Plant's wheelchair recording sessions was not just that he managed to complete his vocal parts under such difficult circumstances, but that he and the band were able to finish the entire Presence album in just 3 weeks, which was an incredibly fast pace for any recording project, especially considering the lead singer's physical condition. The urgency of the recording schedule was partly due to Plant's uncertainty about his recovery timeline and the band's desire to maintain their momentum during what was already a challenging period in their career. The songs on Presence reflect some of the anxiety and intensity that Plant was feeling during this difficult time, with tracks like Achilles' Last Stand containing references to his accident and recovery process. The fact that Plant was able to deliver such powerful vocal performances while dealing with serious physical injuries demonstrates both his dedication to the band and his remarkable resilience as a performer, making Presence one of the most remarkable recording achievements in rock history from a purely human perspective. Fact 8. The $200,000 hotel room heist. On July 29, 1973, Led Zeppelin became the victims of one of rock and roll's most brazen robberies when thieves managed to steal over $200,000 from the band's safety deposit box at the Drake Hotel in New York City while they were performing the final show of their American tour at Madison Square Garden. The timing of the theft was particularly shocking because it occurred on what should have been a triumphant night for the band, as they were completing one of their most successful tours and celebrating their growing dominance of the American rock scene. Tour manager Richard Cole discovered the theft when he went to the hotel's safety deposit box to settle accounts and prepare for the band's departure, only to find that the box had been completely emptied of cash while leaving behind only the band members' passports. Cole later described his shock at opening the box and finding nothing at all, where there should have been a substantial amount of money representing a significant portion of the band's earnings from the entire tour, which had been one of their most financially successful up to that point. The most surreal aspect of this crime was that while Led Zeppelin was on stage at Madison Square Garden, completely unaware that they had been robbed, FBI agents were conducting a thorough investigation of their hotel rooms, searching for clues about how the thieves had managed to access what should have been a secure safety deposit box. Cole made the decision not to inform the band members about the theft until after their performance, recognizing that learning about the robbery would have been a devastating distraction during what was supposed to be the celebratory final show of their tour. The investigation into the theft revealed just how sophisticated the robbery had been, as the thieves had somehow managed to gain access to the hotel's supposedly secure safety deposit box system without leaving obvious signs of forced entry. Despite the FBI's involvement and extensive investigation, the case was never solved, and the $200,000 was never recovered, making this one of the most mysterious unsolved crimes in rock history, and adding an unfortunate footnote to what had otherwise been a hugely successful tour for Led Zeppelin. Fact 9. The Count von Zeppelin legal demand. In 1970, Led Zeppelin faced an unexpected legal challenge when Frau Eva von Zeppelin, a direct descendant of Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin, who had invented the famous airships that bore his family name, demanded that the British rock band immediately stop using the Zeppelin name because she believed it dishonored her distinguished family heritage. Frau Eva was particularly upset that a rock and roll band, with all the wild behavior and controversial reputation that came with that lifestyle, was using her ancestors' name and potentially damaging the historical legacy of the von Zeppelin family. The original Count Ferdinand von Zeppelin had been a respected German military officer and aviation pioneer who developed the rigid airships known as Zeppelins in the early 1900s, and his descendants felt that having a rock band use the family name was inappropriate and disrespectful to his memory. Frau Eva's complaint was serious enough that the band and their management felt they needed to take it seriously, even though they had been using the Led Zeppelin name for over a year and had already released their debut album under that moniker. Rather than engage in a lengthy legal battle with the von Zeppelin family, the band made the surprising decision to temporarily comply with Frau Eva's demands, and on February 28, 1970, they performed a concert in Copenhagen, Denmark under the alternative name The Knobs. This one-night-only name change represented the only time in Led Zeppelin's entire career that they performed under a different name, making it one of the rarest and most unusual shows in their history. However, the name change to The Knobs was met with overwhelmingly negative reactions from both fans and critics, who strongly preferred the original Led Zeppelin name and felt that The Knobs lacked the power and mystique that had made Led Zeppelin so memorable and effective as a band name. The poor reception of the alternative name, combined with the band's own preference for their original choice, led them to return to using Led Zeppelin for their very next performance and for every show thereafter, apparently deciding that the von Zeppelin family's objections were less important than maintaining their established identity. Fact 10. Jimmy Page's controversial costume choice. According to Pamela Des Barres, one of Led Zeppelin's most well-known groupies who spent considerable time with the band during their tours, Jimmy Page engaged in deeply troubling behavior during the mid-1970s by allegedly wearing complete Nazi SS uniforms in various cities while on tour. Des Barres, who later wrote about her experiences with numerous rock stars in her memoir, claimed that Page would don full SS regalia as part of what appeared to be some kind of disturbing fascination with Nazi imagery and symbolism. This alleged behavior occurred during a period when Page was already cultivating a controversial image through his well-documented interest in the occult and his association with Aleister Crowley's writings and philosophy. But wearing Nazi uniforms represented a much more disturbing and offensive level of provocative behavior. The SS, or Schutzstaffel, was the Nazi organization responsible for some of the worst atrocities of World War II, including the operation of concentration camps and the implementation of the Holocaust, making any casual adoption of their uniforms deeply offensive and historically insensitive. Des Barres described these incidents as occurring in different cities during Led Zeppelin's tours, suggesting that this was not a single isolated incident, but rather a pattern of behavior that Page engaged in repeatedly over a period of time. The fact that these alleged incidents took place during the height of Led Zeppelin's fame in the mid-70s means that Page was engaging in this behavior while representing one of the world's most popular rock bands and influencing millions of fans around the globe. The allegations about Page's Nazi costume wearing have never been confirmed by other band members or independently verified, but they come from Des Barres, who had extensive access to the band during their touring years and whose other accounts of rock star behavior from that era have generally been considered reliable. These claims add another layer to the already complex and controversial aspects of Jimmy Page's personality during Led Zeppelin's peak years, when the combination of fame, drugs, and occult interests seemed to create an environment where extremely poor judgment and offensive behavior became possible. Fact 11. The Forbidden Stairway Guitar Store Ban. The opening guitar riff of Stairway to Heaven became so universally recognized and constantly played by aspiring guitarists testing instruments in music stores that shop owners around the world began implementing an unofficial but widespread ban on the song, posting signs that read, "No Stairway to Heaven," or simply telling customers they weren't allowed to play the iconic Led Zeppelin track. This phenomenon occurred because virtually every guitar player who walked into a music shop, regardless of their skill level, would immediately pick up a guitar and attempt to play the instantly recognizable acoustic opening of what many consider to be the greatest rock song ever written. Music store employees and owners found themselves listening to countless variations of the same guitar riff throughout every single day, with some hearing amateur attempts at Stairway to Heaven dozens or even hundreds of times during busy periods, creating a situation where what should have been one of rock's most beautiful compositions instead became a source of annoyance and frustration for people working in guitar shops. The problem was made worse by the fact that many of the people attempting to play the song were beginners who couldn't quite master the finger-picking pattern, resulting in repeated, often poorly executed versions of the same musical passage echoing through music stores across the globe. The No Stairway phenomenon became so well known and widespread that it eventually caught the attention of Hollywood, and the comedy movie Wayne's World immortalized the guitar store ban in a famous scene where the main character Wayne, played by Mike Myers, is immediately stopped by a music store employee when he begins playing the forbidden riff. The scene features a close-up of a "No Stairway to Heaven" sign in the guitar shop, and when Wayne is cut off mid-riff, he responds with the now iconic line, "No stairway? Denied!" which became a cultural reference point that introduced the concept of the stairway ban to an even wider audience. The irony of this situation is that Jimmy Page's beautiful acoustic guitar work, which was intended to showcase the instrument's capabilities and inspire other musicians, became so popular that it actually had the opposite effect in music stores, where it was seen as a nuisance rather than an inspiration. Fact 12. Led Zeppelin never had a #1 hit. Despite selling an estimated 300 million records worldwide and being universally recognized as one of the most successful and influential rock bands in history, Led Zeppelin achieved something that seems almost impossible in retrospect. They never had a single song reach #1 on the charts during their entire career from 1968 to 1980. This remarkable fact becomes even more surprising when you consider that songs like Stairway to Heaven, Whole Lotta Love, and Black Dog are now considered absolute classics that define the sound of rock music for generations of listeners. The closest Led Zeppelin came to achieving a #1 hit was with Whole Lotta Love, which reached #4 on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1970, and Black Dog, which peaked at #15 in 1972. But somehow, none of their most famous and beloved songs managed to climb all the way to the top of the singles charts. This failure to reach #1 becomes even more puzzling when you realize that many of their contemporaries, including bands that are now considered less influential or successful overall, managed to achieve multiple #1 hits during the same era. Part of the explanation for this phenomenon lies in Led Zeppelin's approach to their music and their relationship with radio stations, as the band often created songs that were longer and more complex than what radio programmers preferred for regular airplay during the 1970s. Stairway to Heaven, for example, runs over 8 minutes long and was considered too lengthy for most radio stations to play in its full version, which limited its chart potential even though it became one of the most recognizable songs in rock history. The band's focus on album sales, rather than singles, also contributed to their lack of #1 hits, as Led Zeppelin was primarily interested in creating complete musical experiences through their albums, rather than crafting individual songs specifically designed to climb the singles charts. This approach ultimately proved successful in terms of their long-term legacy and financial success, but it meant that despite their enormous influence and popularity, they joined bands like Jimi Hendrix and Bob Dylan, in the exclusive club of legendary artists who never achieved a #1 single. Fact 13. The ABBA Stockholm Sex Club Connection. During the recording sessions for Led Zeppelin's final studio album, In Through the Outdoor in 1978, the band found themselves working at Polar Studios in Stockholm, Sweden, which was owned and operated by ABBA, the hugely successful Swedish pop group known for hits like Dancing Queen and Mamma Mia. This unlikely pairing of two completely different musical acts created one of the most unexpected cross-cultural encounters in rock history, as the members of ABBA and Led Zeppelin had virtually nothing in common musically, but ended up developing a surprising friendship during the recording process. According to rock legend, ABBA members Benny Andersson and Björn Ulvaeus took it upon themselves to show Robert Plant around Stockholm's nightlife scene after the two groups met at the recording facility and discovered they got along well, despite their vastly different musical styles and public images. The members of ABBA, who were known for their wholesome pop music and family-friendly image, apparently had a much wilder side than their public persona suggested, and they decided to introduce the Led Zeppelin singer to some of Stockholm's more adult entertainment venues. The story goes that Benny and Björn took Plant on a night out that included a visit to a nearby sex club, which would have been a shocking revelation to ABBA's millions of fans around the world who knew the Swedish group primarily for their upbeat, radio-friendly pop songs and colorful disco-era costumes. This alleged night of debauchery represents one of the most unlikely celebrity friendships in music history, as it's difficult to imagine two more different musical acts than the heavy rock pioneers Led Zeppelin and the Swedish pop superstars ABBA. The fact that this encounter supposedly took place at ABBA's own recording studio makes the story even more remarkable, as it suggests that the members of one of the world's most successful pop groups were perfectly comfortable introducing a member of one of rock's most notorious bands to Stockholm's underground adult entertainment scene. This cross-cultural musical exchange demonstrates that even the most seemingly different artists can find common ground when they're away from the pressures of their public images and recording careers. Fact 14. Jimmy Page's occult bookstore business. In 1976, Jimmy Page decided to solve his own frustration with finding quality occult literature by opening his own bookstore called the Equinox Booksellers and Publishers on London's prestigious Kensington High Street, which he operated for approximately 10 years, as both a business venture and a way to share his passion for esoteric knowledge with like-minded individuals. Page had become increasingly annoyed by the lack of serious occult bookshops in London, explaining that there simply wasn't a single store in the entire city where he could find the kind of rare and specialized books on magic, mysticism, and the supernatural that he was constantly seeking for his personal studies. The name, The Equinox, was a direct tribute to Aleister Crowley's influential magazine of the same name, which had been one of the most important publications in the early 20th century occult movement, and had featured Crowley's own writings on magic and mysticism, alongside contributions from other prominent figures in the esoteric community. By choosing this name for his bookstore, Page was making it clear that he intended to focus on serious, scholarly approaches to the occult, rather than the more commercial and superficial materials that were often found in regular bookshops that carried occult sections. Page took a very hands-on approach to running the Equinox, often traveling to rare book dealers and estate sales to personally source unusual and valuable occult texts that would appeal to serious collectors and students of the esoteric arts. He was particularly interested in acquiring original manuscripts, first editions, and books that had been personally inscribed by their authors, building a reputation among London's occult community as someone who could locate materials that were nearly impossible to find anywhere else in the city. The bookstore also served as a publishing house, reprinting several of Crowley's works that had become difficult to obtain, making these important texts available to a new generation of readers who were interested in studying ceremonial magic and mysticism. Page's decision to combine book selling with publishing demonstrated his commitment to preserving and disseminating occult knowledge, showing that his interest in these subjects went far beyond mere curiosity and represented a genuine dedication to understanding and sharing esoteric wisdom with others who shared his fascination with the supernatural. Fact 15. The mysterious album 4 tarot card cover. The mysterious cloaked figure carrying a lantern that appears on the inner sleeve of Led Zeppelin's fourth album has been the subject of decades of speculation among fans who assumed it was connected to the band's well-documented obsession with J.R.R. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. But the truth behind this enigmatic image is actually much more connected to Jimmy Page's interest in the occult than to Middle-earth literature. For years, fans looked at the bent, hooded figure with his staff and lantern and immediately thought of characters like Gandalf or other wizards from Tolkien's fantasy world, especially since Led Zeppelin had already referenced Gollum and Mordor in their song Ramble On, and had made no secret of their love for Tolkien's writing. However, Page later revealed that the hermit figure was actually inspired by the Hermit card from a traditional tarot deck, which depicts a similar robed figure carrying a lantern and represents themes of inner wisdom, spiritual guidance, and the search for deeper truth through solitude and contemplation. This connection to tarot cards makes much more sense when considered alongside Page's broader interests in mysticism, ceremonial magic, and esoteric symbolism, all of which played important roles in Led Zeppelin's visual imagery and lyrical content throughout their career. The choice to use tarot imagery rather than Tolkien references for the album cover demonstrates how Page was drawing from multiple sources of mystical and spiritual inspiration, combining his love of fantasy literature with his serious study of occult traditions and symbolic systems. The Hermit card's themes of seeking knowledge through inner exploration and spiritual journey perfectly match the introspective and experimental nature of Led Zeppelin's fourth album, which featured some of their most mystical and atmospheric music. This revelation about the true source of the Hermit image adds another layer to the mystery and symbolism that surrounded Led Zeppelin 4, an album that was already famous for featuring the four band members' personal symbols instead of their names, and for refusing to include any text or band identification on the cover. The fact that fans spent decades misinterpreting the Hermit's origins shows how Led Zeppelin successfully created an air of mystery around their work that allowed listeners to find their own meanings and connections in the band's carefully chosen imagery.